Good morning, friends. I welcome you all to this e-learning platform of KTHM College. In today's session, we are going to have a look at the summary and analysis of Act 4 and Scene 1st and Scene 2nd of Midsummer Night's Dream by William Shakespeare. Bottom is enjoying his sojourn in Titania's bower. Pease Blossom amiably scratches his head while Cobweb goes off in search of honey for him. As Bottom sleeps in Titania's arms, Oberon walks in, feeling pity for Titania's pitiful love for this ass. Oberon squeezes an herb on her eyes to release her from the spell. Titania awakens, telling Oberon about her strange dream of being in love with an ass. Oberon has Puck remove the ass head from Bottom. Now that Oberon has won the Indian boy from Titania, he is willing to forget their argument, and the two, reunited, dance off together so they can bless Theseus' marriage. Theseus, Hippolyta, and Aegeus are walking through the woods when Theseus suddenly spies the sleeping lovers. Aegeus recognizes them but wonders how they ended up together because Demetrius and Lysander are enemies. Theseus imagines they woke early to observe the rite of May and remembers this is the day Hermia needs to make a choice about her future. When the lovers are awakened, Demetrius confesses that he now loves Helena. No one really understands what has happened. Theseus decides the lovers should be married along with him and Hippolyta. As the lovers return to the palace, the scene shifts to Bottom. Just awakening from his dream, Bottom declares he will have Quincy write a ballad about it called Bottom's Dream because it has no bottom. Now this is the summary of Act 4, Scene 1st. Now we'll have the analysis of Act 4, Scene 1st. Titania and Bottom continue to be entertaining because of the discrepancy in their modes of thinking, a difference that could be ascribed not only to their species but also to their classes. When Titania offers Bottom the soothing music provided by her fairies, he prefers the more rustic entertainment of the tongs and the bones. When she offers him whatever food he desires, he chooses the simple fare of oats and hay. When he prosaically feels an exposition of sleep coming on, a malapropism or disposition, she poetically promises to entwist him, much as the female ivy, the barky elm. While the contrast between these two lovers contributes to the comedy of the play, it also serves Shakespeare's purpose of reminding us that love is blind and possibly deaf. Just like this mismatched couple, love often pairs seemingly inappropriate people. Often played by the same actor, the two rulers in the play, Oberon and Theseus, both insist on getting their way, but they also have a benevolent side. Theseus, for example, offered Hermia the opportunity of living in a nunnery if she didn't marry Demetrius, unlike her father, who offered her only death. Thus, Theseus insists she follow her father's rules, yet also offers a more lenient, more appropriate punishment. Similarly, Oberon shows his compassion for humanity by helping Helena when she is tormented by Demetrius. He also has goodwill for Titania despite their fighting. Although Oberon initially enjoyed her inappropriate love for Bottom, he soon begins to pity Titania. Although he self-servingly releases her from the love spell only after he has won the Indian boy, Oberon seems genuinely pleased when he and Titania are reunited. Aegeus, on the other hand, seems to be an unacceptable model of authority. While he earlier was willing to send his daughter to death because of her refusal to marry the man he has seemingly arbitrarily chosen for her. Here he is equally anxious to condemn Lysander to death for his disobedience. For Aegeus, life is a game, and he is angry primarily because the lovers have defeated him. Hatred and winning are more important to him than love. Therefore, Theseus overrules him, demanding not death from Lysander but marriage. Theseus, like Oberon, participates in the triumph of love within the play. A climax has been reached in the play's action, and it now moves toward a happy ending. Like the moon, the play has come full circle, so a new round can begin. This fresh round commences with a reunion of Titania and Oberon, who will spread prosperity and faith to all of the lovers in the play. The next accord is discovered when Theseus and Hippolyta find the four lovers sleeping in the woods. Before the lovers are discovered, however, the interchange between Theseus and Hippolyta uses the imagery of hunting. The musical baying of Theseus' dogs competes for dominance with the music of Titania and Oberon's fairies, creating a musical confusion. Hippolyta has also come full circle, although the other characters remember her feats as a warrior. The opening scene of the play presented her as passive, almost silent. Here she reminiscences with Theseus about her feats with Hercules and Cadmus, reminding him of her past feats as a hunter. This disjunction between these stories of war and the sight of the four lovers asleep in their bower seems jarring. Why should Shakespeare move so quickly from a discussion of a violent hunt to an image of innocent love? Remember that the surface of this seemingly romantic play has been riddled with violence, from Aegeus' wish to have his daughter killed for disobedience to Demetrius' promise to rape Helena if she did not stop pursuing him. Even Helena's images of taking the masculine role of Apollo carried a trace of rape and violation as they evoked Apollo's violent attempt on Daphne's innocence. In some sense, the play seems to suggest that love and violence are closely aligned. As a pursuit, marriage is a game of domination and control. For example, Theseus and Hippolyta's marriage is not based on an innocent game of romance. Instead, she is a prisoner of war. The quarry Theseus won with his word. In this play, humanity's animal nature is never far from sight. Bottom is transformed into an animal, or perhaps his true self is simply allowed to shine through. Even Titania, a seemingly regal and poetic creature, has an animal side, as shown by her love affair with Bottom, in suggesting that the lovers have come to the woods to celebrate the rites of May, a ritual of sex and fertility. Theseus seems to suggest the often purifying effects of such rituals by allowing the lovers to access their animal sides. Their anger and jealousy have been cleansed, and they can now sleep harmoniously side by side. Waking from their dream in the woods, the lovers cannot remember how they ended up together. Lysander cannot say where he is, showing the inadequacy of language to capture the magical experiences of the woods, just as Demetrius cannot understand what power melted his love for Hermia. Like love itself, the events of the previous evening occurred in a magical zone beyond a realm of human speech or of human understanding. Although Oberon told Puck to erase all their memories of the previous evening, the lovers retained some recollection of their night in the forest, and the love spell is never removed from Demetrius's eyes, emphasizing that the walls separating reality and imagination, sleep and waking, mesh to create a new version of reality. Demetrius is the sole character in the play who is punished, so it seems that hard heartedness is the only unacceptable fault. The true lovers are rewarded, including Helena, who gets her man. In describing his newly rekindled love for Helena, Demetrius uses much the same language Lysander used in Act 3, Scene 1st, again emphasizing the similarities between the two lovers. Like Lysander, Demetrius sees his love for Hermia as a remnant of childhood, an idle god he must discard as he enters adulthood. Similarly, his love for Helena resides primarily in his eyes, of which she is the object and pleasure. He, he adds the imagery of disease to Lysander's formula. His love for Hermia was a sickness that caused him to lose his appetite for his natural food. Now, this true appetite, Helena, has been regained. His language shows the hunger, the lust that underlies and accompanies romantic relationships. Yet, Helena is aware of the discrepancy in Demetrius' character, claiming he is her own but not her own. Love is so much like a dream that she cannot believe in its reality, nor can any of the other lovers. Waking from his adventures in the fairy realm, Bottom also has trouble differentiating reality and illusion. In a moment of wisdom, Bottom realizes that his dream is past the wit of man to say what dream it was. As the lovers discovered earlier in this scene, dreams and visions are often untellable. Indeed, Bottom believes men are asses if they try to explain this dream. Not every event of life is amenable to rational explanation, and some things exist more fully in the realm of the imagination. According to Bottom, such visionary experiences cannot be comprehended by any of the human senses, not eyes, not ears, not hands, not tongues, not hearts. Only art, literature can capture these magical visionary experiences. So Bottom will have Peter Quincy write a ballad about this night with the fairies. Bottom decides to title this piece Bottom's Dream because it has no bottom. All literature and art are bottomless in that their meaning cannot be quantified, cannot be understood solely through the mechanisms of reason or logic. Instead, they must be experienced, must be felt, an interchange that happens between a reader and a text. Although literary critics or other writers may try to guide a reader's responses to a text, each reader must create his or her own vision, limited only by imagination. And an individual's reading of a text will change with the reader's experience. Your first reading of A Midsummer Night's Dream will not be the same as your 20th because your life and circumstances will influence what you notice and how you interpret the play. Thus, the possible interpretations of any piece of literature are infinite and therefore bottomless. The scene ends not only with this vision of infinity but also with a mystery. In his final line, Bottom exclaims that he will sing his ballad at her death, but who is this her? Is Bottom referring to Titania, to Elizabeth? We don't know. Again, a gap exists in the text in which the reader must position him or herself to create a unique reading of the play. This is the analysis of Act 4, Scene 1st. In the next lecture, in the same lecture, we are going to have the summary and analysis of Act 4, Scene 2nd. I will go through the summary of Act 4, Scene 2nd. In this short scene, Quince and Flute are searching for their missing friend Bottom. They worry that Pyramus and Thisbe won't be performed without him. Theseus is known for his generosity and the actors believe they will potentially be rewarded with a lifelong pension for their stellar performance of this play. As they lament this lost opportunity, Bottom suddenly returns. His friends want to hear his story, but Bottom tells them there isn't time for that now. They must prepare for the play. He wants them to avoid onions and garlic so their breath will be sweet for the sweet comedy they will perform. Now this is a summary of Act 4, Scene 2nd. Now we'll have the analysis of Act 4, Scene 2nd. Bottom's friends believe he has been, according to Starveling, transported. His word choice conflicts two meanings, metamorphosed and carried away. As the audience knows, Bottom was indeed carried away by Titania and is the only mortal other than the Indian boy who was successfully penetrated the fairy's bower. Transported is also a word associated with drama, describing the elation and otherworldliness an audience feels when viewing a particularly moving dramatic performance. Like Bottom, the audience of this dream should be transported into a dream world, transformed by the magical performance unfolding in the theatre. The actors feel that only Bottom has the correct attributes to have this type of impact on the audience. Only he can correctly personify Pyramus because of his wit, his good looks, and his sweet voice. Once again, the actor's incorrect use of language adds a comic element to the play. Quincy claims Bottom is a very paramour for a sweet voice, but Flute recognizes the error in his statement. He corrects Quincy, explaining that paragon is the word he should have used and that a paramour is something shameful. Flute is correct, but in some sense, so is Quincy. Bottom was involved in an illicit relationship with Titania, so he warrants the title of paramour, and his sweet voice, his singing, is what first attracted her to him. Much of the humor in this exchange hinges on the layers of meaning hidden in each incorrect word used. In fact, the improper words contain more meaning than the correct ones because they expand the audience's sense of truth. Unlike Quincy and Flute, for example, we know that Bottom has been paramour, so this word actually accounts for more of our experience of the play than Flute's more technically correct paragon. In fact, Bottom seems to be a paragon or shining example of an ass. Like Bottom, the captive audience may be left tight uh, tongue-tied without the words to describe their experience. Bottom recognizes that he has been part of Wanderer's event, yet he cannot explain what it was. Like a dream, his memories of his time in Titania's bower fade as soon as he returns to his everyday world. When Quincy asks for the tale, Bottom cannot utter a word. Instead, he discourses about the upcoming performance of Pyramus and Thisbe, reminding the actors of the mundane activities they must accomplish to make their efforts a success. Thisbe must have clean clothes. The lion should not cut his fingernails because they need to resemble claws, and so on. Once again, Bottom sticks with the bottom line, with the real mundane task, discoursing about discoursing about dreams, speaking in Titania's poetical language, are not Bottom's strengths. Instead, he is a key voice of common sense. This is the analysis of Act 4, Scene 2nd. In the next lecture, we are going to have summary and analysis of Act 5, Scene 1st. Thank you.